Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a SOCA researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, I'm Nate Maynard. I live in London, the Isle of Dogs specifically, and I am an independent environmental consultant, advisor, researcher, communicator, and also a podcaster. And happy to be here with you, Scott, and talk about global citizenship, which doesn't come up a lot in my environmental work. Nobody asks, actually.
Well, I'm happy to be the one to ask, and thank you so much, Nate, for being on the podcast. I'm really excited to learn more about the work that you're doing, perhaps even learning about life in London, how that's been like, because I know it's been a recent move and a transition process. And yeah, just also the fact that we're SUA alumni is also always fun. Always love having SOCA peeps on the podcast. So let's just dive right into it, right? So the first question really is just to kind of set the stage for the rest of our conversation, and to really get to know more about you and your journey to be where you are at right now. And you can take us through, various different milestones of kind of like what led you to do the work that you're doing right now. Feel free to make it as personal as you like, or if you want to lean more towards the professional realm. But it's just kind of like an open question to learn more about you. So yeah, start wherever you'd like.
Great, sure. Yeah, I mean, where I am now really does all kind of go back to SOCA University, ultimately. I am from San Diego, California, originally. Grew up by the beach. Would not consider myself an international person by any stretch. Growing up, I think I thought Pokemon was actually from the U.S. and the Japanese stole it. So that kind of should give you my worldview as a young man. But I had heard about SOCA. I didn't know much about it, really. My best friend wanted to go. We went. I just sort of went on a lark. It seemed like kind of a funny school. I did go to a kind of a non-traditional high school called High Tech High. My whole life sounds made up, actually, sometimes. But anyway, I went to High Tech High and then went to check out SOCA and just totally fell in love. I couldn't believe there was a school that was similar to my high school. There was small class sizes, kind of student-led education that was articulated a bit differently when I was at that high school. But, kind of the same principle of letting the students help co-create or drive education. But I didn't really know much. I knew that I probably didn't really want to be in the U.S., but I don't think I had the language or understanding to really quantify that. Went to SOCA. Lots of stuff happened that we can circle back to, but that got me into Mandarin. And I went to China to study abroad when I was at SOCA, and I really got quite taken by Asia and the Mandarin language, Chinese culture. I hated living in China in 2010. It was quite an awful study abroad. Partly my own fault, being 20 years old, going to Nanjing, and partly, I think, just the challenges of living in a place like China at that time. Then I went into a master's program, and my teachers were Taiwanese. So I got really interested in Mandarin again, kind of a new approach to, I'm going to say, Chinese in sort of the sense of like greater Chinese, not any kind of nation state affiliation. And then ended up spending 8 years there after doing a Fulbright research fellowship. And yeah, happy to go back to that. I mean, for my whole career, it's everything that's driven me has been the environment. That's what I say now, but actually when I went to SOCA, I wanted to do humanities, and I was pretty dead set on being a philosopher or a diplomat or something else I didn't really understand. And it wasn't until I kind of started asking questions around the environmental studies concentration and asking, can I really be a scientist? Can I help take care of a lab? Can I really do experiments? And then I've just always done environmental work, and it's never really been a question for me up until very recently about if I would do that or not. And it's been an incredible journey. And I try and help companies, institutions, people all live more sustainably and communicate that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nate. I love how you kind of comically said that all of these things about your like upbringing and like different places you went to, it just sounds like your life was made up. But maybe eclectic, right? You take the twists and turns of life and you go to where the opportunities are. And it sounds like a wonderful kind of like upbringing where not only for your high school experience at High Tech High, but also for undergrad at SUA, you were in an environment that really sought to hear you out, right? Because of the small class sizes, because of the kind of like agency with which they really believed education should be led by students. And I think that strikes a kind of tone of empowering you to really set forth and understand what do you want to do in this life, right? And going beyond just your initial environment. And so I guess like the first question would be, would you say that was there any particular individual or maybe a particular class that really struck you in terms of like wanting to like go beyond the just the States? I mean, was it that friend who told you about SUA? Was it an interaction with other students from your university that got you thinking like, okay, I'm going to say bye to San Diego and finally discover where Pokemon comes from? I don't know.
So, despite the joking tone, I do have a fairly sad story as to how that was the case. But basically, I was a little interested in international things. Once I figured out that Japan made Pokemon, I got quite interested in Japan. And I had really, really wanted to go to Japan. And my mom at the time started taking Japanese lessons. And she said, challenging, work history, worked in call centers, that sort of things, parents separated, and she really wanted to be able to take me to Japan. Unfortunately, she got breast cancer and passed away my first year at SOCA. So it was really one of those strange moments of, my kind of initial part of my life sort of collapsing, your kind of mother-father framework. And then the wish that I had had when I was 13, I could now do when I was 18, because let's be honest, I couldn't really just go to Japan, me and my mom, by ourselves with like a rudimentary grasp of Japanese. But because I went to SOCA and I had made a bunch of, friends who were Japanese my first year, I was able to then go to Japan, unfortunately without my mom, but, with kind of a new community that really took me in. And I wasn't super public at SOCA at the time about my mom's passing then. But, for the people that did know, they really did support me. So then going to Japan and kind of having that wish fulfilled, I saw, oh my God, there's a whole other planet, the streets are clean. There's public transit. There's, all these other amazing things. And it made me realize that there's other alternative ways of living. And then, being at SOCA, being around other people from other parts of the world, that just stimulated my curiosity. And it kind of just grew and grew from there. I didn't know I'd end up in Taiwan. I had no idea I'd be in London today, but, that was kind of the seed and sort of following that thread. So I guess, I only bring that up now just to sort of be like, you kind of need to go and push yourself and follow even your like faintest dreams, no matter how irrational they are, because you never really know where they might take you in the future.
Beautifully said. And thank you so much for sharing that. I know that we went from joking tone to suddenly, oh, my mother died of breast cancer. And, it's heavy.
I do that, I'll do that. We'll slip around. It's all good,
Okay. No, but I appreciate you for sharing that. And I wanted to, just kind of like acknowledge how incredibly difficult that must have been at the time. You said that your world felt like it was kind of just collapsing suddenly, and you were at a very at a time of your life where you're formative years, right? Kind of going into college, new place, new peoples, new prospects, and it just I kind of want to ask, like, a little bit more about your mom, if that's okay. Like,
Sure.
why Japan? What kind of like motivated her to like have that as her dream, and then to kind of plant the seed in your mind that, you should go on a trip together?
Well, my mom was quite, I mean, you might notice a family pattern, but my mom was quite strange as well. And she was really into martial arts. She took karate. I didn't, because, you don't want to do what your parents do, because that's lame. But, she got up to being a brown belt and, loved Bruce Lee, loved Jackie Chan, and, was really supportive of all of my nerdy interests. So I think she got into Japan a little bit because I was into it, but then she was into, martial arts. She liked sort of like blaxploitation action films like Shaft, loved Samuel Jackson. So and I never really got any, specific advice from my parents. So it was more like, here's all these things. The world is cool and interesting. That sort of led me down that path, and she did try and take me to the zoo, and, it kind of exposed me to the environment as much as possible. I had a good childhood, and then adversity struck, but that's just sort of how you kind of define yourself as an individual, I think. And Soka was a tricky place to go through all of that, but that's just sort of what being a person is, I think, is, trusting people, and sometimes being hurt, but other times, building a new family.
Yeah, definitely. Building a new family, being embraced by a community, a global community at that, right? You were talking about how you were able to go to Japan with so many friends from SUA who happen to be from Japan, right?
Yeah.
And this point about adversity, I think, is very important, right? Because as we're getting older, life happens, and we are hit with, obstacles and hardships, in whatever arena, and it's really how we deal with it, right? How we either push past it, transform it, that leads to new outcomes and kind of allows us to see ourselves differently. And I know that going abroad, it's very stimulating already, right? The unknown, the awe of seeing different sights and smells, and just meeting different people, not knowing the language, for example. And so to have also that kind of like internal, like emotional realm, kind of how you're anchored even with like your immediate family, to be so suddenly, ruptured, or to be in that healing process, that grieving and healing process, must have been quite shocking. But now kind of,
I don't think I was even aware of the healing process. I mean, I could kind of use this as a pivot to sort of talk about burnout. I mean, I think at the time, my logic was, okay, I could die at any moment, so I need to do impactful work. And I've received so much from my parents, and then at Soka, I've received so much, from scholarships and all these sorts of things, that I need to really make impact. And so for a long time, I think the way I would handle uncertainty and stress was to overwork in somewhat unhealthy patterns. So now I've like gone to therapy and thought about this a lot. So, I can see that, but definitely when I was younger, I probably did not handle that in the way that I should have. And if I could have done things differently, I would have sort of unlinked that, because, ultimately, like, if you use adversity as your fuel, then you may not like what happens to the engine of your car if you keep putting in like bad oil, basically, to use a totally polluting fossil fuel example.
It's all good. So I appreciate this point about burnout, and then how you also tie that to impact, right? Because I think this is something that people often consider, right? The kind of impact, and then henceforth like the legacy that one wants to leave. And then in broader strokes, right, the purpose, like why are we even getting up out of bed every single day? So I definitely want to circle back to that. I first wanted to kind of address something about this, environmental focus that you had, and that was kind of initially, sparked in undergrad, but then from your master's program to then the Fulbright taking you to Taiwan, it seems like that's where you really hit your stride and were like full out sprinting to really make that impact. But could you tell me, like, what shifted your perspective away from the philosopher diplomat road, the humanities? Like what initially got you thinking, okay, it's going to be the environment specifically?
I think I always wanted to do the environment. If you look at my old elementary school yearbooks and stuff, it was like marine biologist, archaeologist. I always loved animals. That was always there. I think there wasn't really such a thing as an environmental job. Certainly I had no knowledge of that when I was 18. It was like work at the aquarium or work at the zoo. And then at Soka, there was like this promise that there would be more environmental work. This was 2008 when I entered Soka, and Obama had just been elected, and we're like, okay, we're gonna finally do climate change, was sort of the notion. So I just sort of figured, okay, well, the environment's the most important thing in the world, obviously. So if I work on this, inevitably there'll be some job for me to do. So that was sort of it. I was always personally interested, but the reason I didn't do it as a career until, a little bit into my time at Soka was because of just like, what job do you do? Are you a park ranger? Are you do you work at a power plant? Are you a designer? And now there's, thousands and thousands, millions of environmental jobs, but it was not always the case. So that's probably why I've had such a varied career, because I was just a little too early into the environmental sector. But not too late.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's awesome when we're able to kind of look back and connect those dots. All the way from, your childhood, and being able to say like, oh yeah, actually that interest was always there, right? And maybe it was something nurtured by, your parents. Maybe it was something innate. Oh, innate.
Yeah, it's innate.
It is innate. Sorry, the puns just. I don't know where that came from. But yeah, I find that, this process of refining that interest and then exploring this emerging job market is important to then sustain the work, right? Because, hey, we all need money, and that's important. But also what's more important than the environment. And so dedicating your life towards that aim, I think is really noble. But yeah, like, your time in Taiwan, though, if you can maybe speak more about what actual like research and like activities towards
what did I do? Yeah.
8 years is a long time. So what was going on in Taiwan?
It is. Yeah. So I went to Taiwan on a Fulbright fellowship. My master's program really encouraged us to do that. I went there to study coral reef economics because, being a bit too early, we had just started to learn about ocean economics, that, the ocean has an economic value that's excluded normally unless, we calculate it and share it and incorporate it into policy. So I was really into that at the time, in marine protected areas. And I obviously wanted to kind of work in China originally. This was before I lived in Taiwan. But then once I went to Taiwan and realized that it was, I'm just going to say a normal country, just to kind of like simplify things. But, when you go to China, it's different. It's a communist society that has a lack of freedom. It's difficult to work there. And some people have found ways to do that, but I didn't particularly. So I applied to the Fulbright in Taiwan, got it, and I'd worked on coral reef economics. So I was trying to value the Kending National Park's marine reserve. Now, when I got there, I realized that nobody wanted me to do that, not in some grand conspiracy way, but just because people were illegally fishing. The park was what's called a paper park. People would just take coral out of the beach area and use it to build homes, and they would, the park was just set up without consulting like indigenous groups in the area. There's a lot of issues basically that one 24-year-old American with like an economics degree really couldn't even begin to solve. But the work was interesting, and seeing how Taiwan was left out of this environmental conversation made me think that there was an opportunity for me to actually have some value there. So I started working with a think tank. They liked me, my research, whatever, and what I was doing. And I kind of aggressively pursued them to try and create a position. And then I started working at a think tank. It's a 40-year-old economic think tank in Taiwan. And I was not the only foreigner, but the only Westerner. And that was quite a strange experience. I was there for 4 years. After that, I kind of chopped up my time in Taiwan around energy, ocean, and waste. I started doing ocean work when I was there, no jobs. Then I pivoted into renewable energy, and then ultimately kind of trash and the circular economy, which Taiwan is a leader in. So it's funny. People always say like, oh, Nate, you always know what you wanted to do. And maybe in sort of like the mindfulness sense of like, in that moment, I know what I wanted to do. But, I really had, my long-term vision would change daily. So it was just, just following the threads that were there. But yeah, that was my Taiwan work. I did a lot. I was there for 8 years. I could say more about what I've done.
Oh, I mean, I think that it's wonderful hearing about this specific interest and how you really were at the forefront of kind of, asking big questions and pushing to have more action be taken, especially with this marine reserve, and then this progression that you pointed out from like energy, ocean, and then to trash. I know that it's kind of a little bit funny. It's like, oh, what do you do? What do you research? And you're like, I study trash. I just rummage in the dumpster.
I call myself a trash man, or a waste person, garbage guy.
Yeah,
lots of good terms.
Could you maybe share a little? Because I know that you also created a podcast that had a very, very clever name of Waste Not, Why Not, and
nice.
It just flows up, rolls off the tongue, but just this notion of like trash. Could you maybe explain just really briefly like why that's so important? Because again, like people, and myself included, would probably be quick to make a joke of like, yeah, just like, rummaging through the trash. Like why is that so important? But I know that there's so much more behind it that maybe for listeners, they don't realize. And then maybe from hearing you, they'll get passionate about it and then subscribe.
Yeah. So the podcast is called Waste Not, Why Not. We've been on a hiatus as I moved to London, but we're going to start gearing up and launching new episodes soon. So now's your chance to go subscribe. Trash is one of the most visible environmental issues, but it's one that is philosophical. And I think it becomes, maybe going back to the death and morbidity thing, you kind of realize that trash is a philosophical distinction. The clothes you're wearing now, the computer we're talking through, this will all be trash one day. And it's determined to be trash because we just sort of point at it and go, that's trash. Maybe it doesn't work anymore. Maybe it works fine, but we still decide that it's trash. It's kind of the invisible evil twin to consumption, and I'd say like consumerism as well. And to kind of bring it into like a climate perspective, because I think sometimes when we think about climate change, we focus on the big stuff, food, energy, transportation. And if you look at waste, it's not really a huge percentage of carbon emissions, but the reality is that the majority of carbon emissions from a product more often than not come from the raw material stage. So drilling oil, growing cotton, chopping down a tree to create that primary material. The more that we can reuse these materials and keep them inside of industrial supply chains, we're creating our own ecosystems. We're matching nature. There is no trash in nature. Everything is decomposed and reused and repurposed to an extent, right? I mean, there's always outliers and stuff, but in general, like in an ecosystem, there is no waste. That is not the case in the US. We have an enormous amount of landfills. We have an enormous amount of things that will never become another product. So I think waste is the most fascinating thing. It's something that everyone has an opinion on. And it's also a bit different from other environmental areas, other than maybe like electricity, because if you don't get your waste picked up for a week, your life is over. I mean, your life will grind to a halt. If you don't have power for a week, your life will also grind to a halt. But, you think about that more often than trash. So I was just, think about the waste.
And waste less, if possible, or be
waste
able to
less.
Recycle that.
Yes, if you can. I mean, I'm not one to really harp on the impacts of individuals. I think it's, we need to pass specific legislation. We need to have specific mindsets about waste. I don't really want to like jump down the throat of my neighbor who buys 5 boxes of Evian plastic bottles, from plastic water bottles. you don't need to do that. We live in London. You can just drink the tap water. But, at the same time, I'd much rather like focus that energy into influencing a policy that just makes it so plastic water bottles cost so much money that they're only used for their intended purpose.
Yeah. Well, actually, this kind of ties into the next question that I want to ask, because, you're identifying that there are certain calls to action that an individual can take, right, with this knowledge of trash or any kind of environmental issue that they're kind of looking at. But there's also these larger initiatives from, state governments, right, and policies that can be implemented, regulation of certain companies or multinationals. And this is, very, very important. And this is probably where most of your energy with like your attention goes into your research, I would imagine. But you have like a multi-pronged approach where you speak about it via podcast platforms and other writings that you do. But like, how do you kind of reconcile between the impact that you're hoping to have as an individual, as Nate, but then also looking to these larger entities that the scope of it is much larger?
Yeah. I've had quite a big change in how I quantify the impact in my life, and that's because I think I've hit the benchmarks that I had wanted to. So originally, I really wanted to get a large, I'm just going to talk about Taiwan for this example. I really wanted to get a large Taiwanese corporate to set 100% renewable energy target, and then to have others commit, because I knew if we got large ones to commit to use only renewable electricity, we'd start to get other companies onboarding. And I helped to make that happen. And I say help to make that happen because when you get down into environmental work, this could have been, creating a native plant garden at Soka. This could have been renewable energy targets. It could be the podcast, whatever. You realize that it's never just you. How do you actually know what your impact is? Are you the person who, signed the contract to buy the renewable energy? Were you the bank? Were you the person who installed the solar panels? Were you the power company? Were you the legislator that allowed this to happen? And then it gets even worse if you think about like net zero targets. Maybe the janitor is the most important person because they're the person who's tracking the waste, or they're tracking the energy usage. So I realized once I had kind of achieved the things that I thought I wanted to achieve environmentally, that it was never enough. I didn't feel like I had actually achieved it. And two, it was always a group of people. So by that same logic, I don't think we can just kind of blame individuals, for their environmental impact. And I think people get, obviously if you're like riding a jet ski powered with coal onto your private jet, yeah, I mean, we're going to have a conversation. But, if you're just sort of living your life, like everybody else, is that really your fault? Do you just wake up and you're like, how can I destroy the environment as much as possible? So I quantify that impact now by the number of people whose lives I've impacted, essentially. And I think, I was kind of complaining to a friend when I just started Waste Not, Why Not? And I was saying, oh, like, what's the point of this podcast work? Like, I should just be doing other policy work. And they said, well, but if two people listen to your podcast and they tell two people and they tell two people and so on, you've actually had an enormous impact. And then they're going to live, 30, 40 more years, and they're going to tell more people and tell more people. So I started to think about my environmental impact. And, there's some books about this that kind of get into it, like Cradle to Cradle. But it's sort of, what is your positive footprint and how do you impact people, rather than looking for like specific KPI metrics of, well, okay, I've saved 10 tons of carbon and I've saved 20 tons of plastic, so now I can go emit 5 tons of carbon. It's never going to balance out. And I think that, it's okay to be anxious and it's okay to have, climate anxiety or whatever that is. But if you try to just like balance the book, you won't, and you'll waste a lot of time and you'll be unhappy. So my advice is to just like be in a community of people trying to make things better and work towards doing that, and let someone else, like an Egyptian god, measure your heart when you die, and then you'll know like how your deeds do, basically.
You've thought a lot about that last point, right? the Egyptian god.
Yeah, I'm going to write an article about this at some point. So, you're kind of giving me some good prompts.
I can't wait to read that. And this is this is really, really thought provoking. This notion of like, is it ever enough? And balancing the books in terms of like how much carbon you emit and how much you're able to kind of like reduce. And I see this with like, airline companies do this a lot, right? It's like this is if you take like this layover, then you're emitting this much more, or like try to reduce it or pay money to kind of balance it out yourself. And it's just that quantifying of impact is a rabbit hole, that's for sure. And not something that I think you point to how it's important to still have these metrics of like how are we making progress towards certain goals in reducing plastic consumption, for example, but to not stake it as the be all end all, but to also recognize that there's a kind of I don't even know if you'd say lifestyle, but an attitude of like kind of constantly seeking out impact in other arenas of one's life that are not necessarily tied to a corporate agenda, right, or policy that is going to be carried out. And so I wanted to ask, is because this is all getting me thinking about like, well, what about like the social movements that are really trying to make change and like, further kind of spread this awareness? And I know a major one is like Fridays for Future. And is that something that, you get behind? Is that something that you see value with like the impact as well? And how does that relate to your more like research oriented approach? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. And like,
yeah, it's complicated. Not my views about Fridays for Future and, Greta Thunberg, but I think they do great stuff. I think that, direct action is a really powerful way to get people motivated. And I think the student climate strikes were effective for a couple reasons. One is that they were consistent. They were always there on Friday. The other is that they're children, and so they can't vote. So they're kind of, they're not interfering with their studies. They're frankly probably learning more, and they're also, engaging with people around them, which will give them really important organizing and life skills. I remember when I was 17, I worked at an aquarium and I talked to climate deniers all the time. And that was 2007. So that was a lot harder to like really talk to people about climate change back then. So I think it's good. And, I have evidence of this because I went to Climate Week NYC, which was in 2019. It's a big climate event around the UN General Assembly. It's actually happening right now in New York. And when I went there back in 2019, I heard someone say, and I always made fun of them for this, but they said, I'm so glad about those student climate strikes because now I can talk about climate change in the boardroom. And I don't think that's true. I think you probably always could have talked about climate change in the boardroom. But when you have CEOs' children saying, Dad, I hate you, you're polluting the earth, that really does make a difference. I think that's a really big change with other types of direct action movements that are pretty common, like here in the UK. There's things like Extinction Rebellion, and they will do things like glue themselves to trains, or they will, some were arrested for planning to block a highway. And others, they do the soup can, just stop oil to the soup can all over the painting. And I think that when you're doing direct action, it needs to be related as closely as possible to the thing that you're trying to eliminate. So if you're throwing soup on a painting, people are going to assume you're protesting the painting. Even if you explain stuff, even if it's eye-catching, they're just going to miss the mark. So it doesn't really bleed into my work so much, other than companies that have decided to do the right thing environmentally will try to do the right thing environmentally. Companies that have a culture where they are not receptive to that, they will never do the right thing environmentally. And it's probably not worth working with them because it is going to be so difficult to bring them on side that energy would be better spent either bringing like a neutral party onto the side of sustainability, or taking someone who wants to do something ambitious and helping them do something even more ambitious. So I think about it a lot. It comes up a lot because I think to many, I'm like a friendly environmentalist. so they can say, what's with all those tree huggers that throw soap, and all that stuff. And I have a nuanced response for them. I do eat, vegetarian meals. I eat vegan meals. I also eat meat. I'm a human being. It's subsidized here. I'm not having steaks every night, but at the same time, if I see a cheap pork shoulder, I'm gonna make pulled pork out of it and make crackling out of the skin. And I think we need to have a much bigger conversation about animals and all those things. But yeah, it's complicated. I don't know how to end that, so just ask me the next question, Scott.
that was a great nuanced response. And yeah, thank you for taking us kind of on that whirlwind of like the goods, right, of like why these social movements emerge in the first place, that kind of impact across multiple levels of society, especially from the youngest, the younger generations, and how it's true that they will inherit the world, and what's happening right now in the present is setting the conditions for the future. And so it's a really brilliantly framed movement, that also that consistency piece is so vital, right? Because you can't just have it be a one and done kind of event and just kind of naively think, yeah, change has happened, right? Because again, it comes down to like quantifying it, and then the like sustainable kind of long-term perspective of like how can we even determine that impact or the success of that movement unless it is sustained. So I think a lot about that, not just within the environmental movements, but across any kind of like, widespread movement that is like seeking, like it could be social justice, right? Major, right? Especially in the United States.
Yeah.
And that kind of like reckoning and atonement that yes, certain blame is being doled out. And yes, very much so, like the history, especially in the US with racial injustices, is fully merited. And yet there's such nuance that gets in the way of us kind of having that definitive, okay, this is where we're at right now, and this is how much progress we've made. Because it's just time and time again, we see that as soon as we declare progress is made and success is there, there's a setback, right? And it comes at seemingly unexpected times. But yeah, I appreciate your very candid response. And again, like you're approaching it from many different levels, right? With the podcast and trying to reach more viewers, listeners, and the fact that you are sitting at the tables of a lot of different organizations and companies and presenting your research and engaging them in a very different kind of level of like sophistication of this is where we're at and this is what we're trying to untangle or unpack. So, I wanted to now kind of ask more explicitly about the topic of global citizenship. I mean, already from our conversation, I've like picked up some themes, one being kind of hardship is something that you very clearly made evident from like your personal life, but also from your professional life, right? Going to China, then living in Taiwan. Now you're in, London. But that created hardship in different forms. And then, I really appreciate this conversation about impact and the different ways with which we make impact, how we understand impact. And then there's a third point that also kind of came up in my head that you did not actually say, but maybe I'm just kind of putting it out there because maybe it might resonate. But I think that, the work that you're doing is so complex and it's so big, right? This is involving all of not just humanity, but all life on this planet. And so it's easy to get kind of like paralysis of just like, oh, there's no way to actually show that we're making any advances, or it's just getting really difficult, or like that person, that CEO is just being not nice. But I think, hope, right? That things will get better, right? That your actions will make a difference, that your impact will be felt. I think that's also another thing that's kind of coming up. So I just wonder, do you agree with that? Or is there anything that you would add on top of that in the context of this notion of what does it mean to be a global citizen?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to come back to the hope piece because I think that really ties in with the the whole climate protest and a lot of social protest movements. If you are 10 and you turn on the news, you might hear that we only have 10 years to stop climate change. That's 100% of your life. It's like that. Your whole life is just, that's it. And by the time you're 20, it's too late. And I think that it is good to have that language to encourage people to take action now. We only have so much time left, but we need to be mindful of how that's heard by younger and older ears. What if you're 70 and they say, well, climate change will destroy the world in 10 years? Well, whatever, I'm 70, I'm done. So I think that, the framing around that matters. I guess I'm an optimist. I mean, I keep doing this every day. It's not like I wake up and go, yippee, I'm so happy. I can't wait to, beg people to stop destroying the earth. But at the same time, it is that inconsistency or incongruency between, what you want the world to be and what it is, and to kind of get there. And I think that exists a lot within people who would identify as or want to be global citizens. You have kind of the culture that you've inherited when you were born. You have no choice, we don't think, of where you're born. And then you get all this stuff and then you go somewhere else and then you might pick up different stuff. I was in Taiwan for 8 years and my worldview changed. When I come home to eat dinner with my dad, he's like, let's get Thai food. And I'm like, okay, great. We'll get some dishes to share. And he says, no, what are you going to get? So, there's that, there's other things like, hey, Dad, you're getting a bit older. Maybe I should come back and live with you. Why would you live with me? Where are you going to stay? So my worldview has started to shift and become, I'm by no means, fully Taiwanese or anything like that. But, my worldview has shifted in that. So now you kind of just, maybe I just been doing it so long, I'm just sort of comfortable with living with all of these, competing frameworks. And I think that all global citizens kind of manage that. Hardship. Yeah, it sucks being a global citizen. You have a different passport. You have to do visa stuff. Most Americans, I certainly didn't really know what a visa was for quite a long time. And you have to deal with that. But, on the other side of it, you get rich experiences that sound fake. I've seen dolphins in the Amazon. I've, been to Angkor Wat multiple times, fished there. That was just, both of those were just at Soka. So, there's trade-offs to it. Not sure where else you wanted to go with global citizenship. I could just ramble on forever.
No, that was wonderful. I really resonated with what you shared about how your worldview really shifts as a result of living in different cultures, cultural contexts, right? And that you, with your dad being like, yeah, let's share a meal, like let's share some Thai food, and then him being like, no, I'm gonna eat my food and you'll eat your food. And again, I'm also from California, and my dad has like a very similar kind of approach. And yeah, my time in Brazil, it led me to really like talk a lot with my hands and be a lot more touchy, right, with people. Like the kind of like,
yeah.
There is no real bubble in my experiences in Brazil. And so I would come back and I would be talking with my hands and I would be like pointing, kind of just, but like pointing at, if you point enough at an American, generally speaking, they'll think you're like accusing them of something. And that's actually kind of like a little hostile and they'll get mad. And so I remember doing that pointing thing with my mom unknowingly. And she got offended. She's like, why are you pointing at me? And she was like really offended. And I had to stop myself and be like, oh, I guess this is the global citizen moment. I stepped too far into one reality.
Yeah, and you don't know, right? Because, culture is like water to a fish. So, you don't know you're in it. And then suddenly someone's like, stop pointing at me. You better eat your own meal and, you can't stay here. So
not as hopeful as we were hoping to put it out there. But I mean,
that's the hope. That's the point of hope.
We got to maintain it. So, I like that you were very thoughtful about the word hope and being like, well, I'm still doing the work, so I guess yes, I'm optimistic, but there's certain realities that we come up against with kind of like frustration, setbacks, walls that lead you to believe, oh, they really don't want this to change. But then in your head, right, with your morals and values, you're thinking, but it has to, right? Like, how come they're not seeing what I'm seeing? And that's the difficulty of doing any work that's, I would say, meaningful, right? Is to like be able to like continuously come up against that wall, and then finding other ways to either go around it, to go over it, to go through it, but in a way that like will then be true to your sense of like what impact you want in the world. And so the fact that you have had a very interesting life that I don't think is made up at all. I fully believe you that you swam with dolphins and fished in where is that? In Cambodia?
I saw dolphins in the Amazon. I did not swim with them.
You didn't ride the dolphins, and
I didn't ride the dolphins. No,
with the dolphins.
No.
Okay.
There's the size limit. It's frowned upon.
Right. Yeah. People can't tell just from the video, but you're actually quite tall. So
I'm 6'6".
Yeah, you'd have to be a really like big dolphin to want to, maybe like an orca, but I don't think they would be in the Amazon.
I tried out for Free Willy, but it just didn't go anywhere.
No. Hey, you tried at least. So
yeah,
we're kind of coming to the end of our conversation. It's been really wonderful, Nate. I really appreciate all the knowledge and insight and reflection that you've been able to offer about the important work that you're doing, and not just with the podcast, but also with a lot of like the consulting and like being there doing research on various different environmental issues. So I know that you probably read all the time, and just based on some of your interests, I'm sure you have like quite an eclectic reading list as well. But just from our conversation, like what would you say is like, no, not judging from your background, but
are you reading my books behind me? No.
But yeah, like, do you have any book or movie recommendations that you think kind of align with our conversation? And this could be something that you go back to quite frequently that you just really like, or maybe something more recent that you'd like to just kind of throw out there.
Yeah, I think classic environmental books that still hold up. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It's cliche, but it's an important work written by a woman who at the time was not taken seriously and received a lot of death threats. And I think she only had her master's at the time she wrote that book as well. So, and we still talk about it today. So yeah, Silent Spring, if you haven't read it, is fantastic. Two kind of strange environmental books that have really, really shaped my worldview. One is called Slow Violence by Rob Nixon. And that is a good way to link environmental and social issues, because he coined this term or popularized this term called slow violence, which is that the world experiences way more intense violence that is slow, spread out through time, invisible, affects marginalized communities than the exciting, bombs, explosions, shootings, stabbings that occur. And because we focus on that visible, one might even say sexy violence, we ignore the slow violence. So really good book. Check it out. That's by Rob Nixon. And Spell, I might mess this up, but Spell or Song of the Sensuous is a book about, I think he was also a Fulbright researcher doing something about puppets or something, but he was in the jungles of Indonesia and wrote a series of essays about how nature provides a necessary companion to the human experience. We talk about a babbling brook, the songs of birds. We need to expose ourselves to nature to hear this full range of conversation. And if we don't, then we are at risk of just sort of speaking to ourselves and kind of not only limiting our creativity, but limiting our understanding of the world. And then I mentioned Cradle to Cradle. And actually with Waste Not, Why Not, we have a whole recommendation list of video games, movies, books, comics that are all environmental. And I think it's somewhere, and I can send it to you or link it to you.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for all of those recommendations. I've only read the first one, but the other two sound fascinating and very important. So I
think you'd like both of them, Scott. Yeah.
Okay. I will look into both of them. And I think it's The Spell of the Sensuous, not The Song of the Sensuous. So I was just doing like a quick little
That makes sense. Spell, Song, it's not a very sensuous book, but it is a good one.
Yeah. By David Abrams, right?
Yes, that's what it is. That's
Okay.
what it is.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nate. Really appreciate having you on the podcast. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. Yeah, I wanted to give like the last word. Any final concluding thoughts or just like a send off as we wrap things up?
I think, one thing I learned in therapy was this short phrase, and I think it's pretty good, environment, social work, whatever it is. And it's just to keep in mind, it's like this now. And that's how you just keep going forward. It's like this now. The CEO doesn't want to do it. It's like this now. The CEO wants to do it. It's like this now. The world is polluted. It's like this now. And it'll be like something else later. So gives me comfort. Hope it gives you all some comfort too.